In the offices at King's Cross, auditors were going through the Great North Railway's shareholders' balance sheets. It was just a routine inspection, but things were not adding up. It seemed that a shareholder was being overpaid. This wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and it had happened before. But when they approached the shareholder in question to ask for the money back, he was astounded. He had no shares in the GNR at all and had no idea where the shares had come from. The auditors reported this to Registrar Mr. Clark, and he was just as confused. Something was clearly wrong. In the meantime, after 6 years, Leopold had handed in his notice. It seemed a little coincidental, but when the GNR heard of this, they sacked Mr. Clark. Many thought Mr. Clark was a useless and bungling fool, and that the registrar's job could be done by others. As Mr. Clark was swiftly disposed of, Leopold presented himself back as Mr. Clark's successor. The directors were pleased and wanted to recruit him at once to the position of registrar. But that position was a coveted one and required someone with the utmost trust and with little risk. They instructed him that his stock market gamblings had to cease. If he became bankrupt, that could damage the railway. Leopold agreed and even gave the railway a loan from his own pocket. Their earnings. For the next 4 years, Leopold would continue his career defrauding the company. He would take trips to Paris, buy expensive art, and even a manor house in the heart of countryside, even entertaining his own directors who had no inkling that they were paying for the splendour around them. The auditors were back in 1854 and noted that the payments to shareholders still seemed excessive. They sent a note to Leopold that he himself must be to blame, but citing clerical errors and to not cause alarm with the other shareholders, they decided to sign off the accounts. The chief bookkeeper to the accountant, however, wasn't happy. He communicated his concerns of the overpayments to the accountant Thomas Reynolds, who in turn took the discrepancies to the secretary J.R. Mowat. Mowat went straight for Leopold and asked for a statement explaining the accounts, while the chief bookkeeper dug deeper and found that the accounts were £90,000 out of balance. He took the findings again to Reynolds, but Reynolds dismissed him, stating that he would do things his own way. Either way, the matter was not addressed again until 2 years later in 1856, when Leopold finally sent the statement. Leopold told him he would investigate the matter, and the matter was left in his hands. In the August of that year, the auditors were called in again, and again, despite the discrepancies, they confirmed the accounts were correct and signed them off. But by mid-September, an unrelated fraud had rocked the financial world by a clerk working at the Crystal Palace Company. Some shareholders prefer to leave their shares in the hands of the company for safekeeping. Being on paper, they were easy to steal, so the company would give these to the clerk. This particular clerk, instead of storing the shares away, transferred them to another's name before selling them on for a profit. Although the perp was caught, it sent alarms through every shareholding company in the country. Just what was going on in those offices? And with the rumblings that the GNR had discrepancies, it made everyone a little uneasy. Concerned, Leopold was told that his investigation simply wasn't fast enough, and they needed results. Leopold again handed in his resignation, but the directors rejected it, citing further investigations. After having enough of Leopold's stalling, Mowat decided to take matters into his own hands. He waited until Leopold had left and he was alone, and he snuck into Leopold's office and checked the books. What he found made him run straight to the chairman. The chairman ordered a full inquiry. The following Tuesday, the books were seized. It was said that Leopold was furious and threw the books on the table. He stepped out of the office and never returned. It took a while to detangle the mess, but gradually the enormity of Leopold's actions came to light. To many, it was surprisingly simple. He forged share certificates in either known names or fictional names and then register that transfer. To give the forged shares some credibility, the shares were registered as OB, meaning Old Book, seemingly looking that they were transferred from a previous ledger. Now armed with the shares, he sold them on to stockbrokers, pocketing the money. In addition to forging shares, he would buy legitimate shares within the company. He would generally use either a real or an assumed name, but when he entered them into the books, he would inflate the price. The money was paid into the accounts he could easily access, and he would just adjust the inflation so he wouldn't arouse suspicion. Leopold's fame and fortune now seemed to work against him. He was a man on the run, and the papers, who only a few months before had praised him, made him one of the most wanted men in the country. His assets were frozen, including his bank accounts, and the police seized control of his London estate. The police also noted that he seemed to have an accomplice, Charles Kent, through correspondence. Charles was a clerk himself and seemed to be Leopold's protégé. He also had clues where Leopold was hiding. The police, after arresting Kent, were too late. By the time they entered the house, Leopold was already setting foot in Paris. Through evidence and a bungle by a porter, giving away Leopold's whereabouts, the police followed Leopold, but by the time they arrived, Leopold had flown. Amazingly, he travelled back to London and went to a property overlooking Regent's Park. The occupier of the house was a GNR official and alerted Moa of Leopold's arrival. Armed with police, he was arrested with a simple, "I'm sorry." Justice was swift in the Victorian world, and none was swifter than Leopold's. In less than 2 hours after his arrest, Leopold was in the dock. The new clerk department had scrutinised all the accounts and the results were damning. In the new mansion, Jessie heard of her husband's fate and saw her luxury life end in a heartbeat. All of her items, her homes, were seized and she was declared homeless. She made her way to the place where her husband had taken refuge, seeking now refuge herself. Leopold Redpath and Charles Kent were brought to the Old Bailey to face their crimes. Kent's lawyer cited that Kent was young and impressionable, and he had never set out to commit fraud. He was a good man with 10 witnesses ready to call on his character. The court took pity on the man, and the jury didn't even leave to deliberate. They cleared Charles Kent on all charges, and he walked away scot-free. Leopold was not so lucky. Patrons of the charities he supported wept as the jury handed down the guilty verdicts. After liquidating all of his assets, the money made didn't even put a scratch on the £253,391 that the GNR lost. Leopold was once again declared bankrupt, but this time no quirks in the law would save him. The GNR was in turmoil. The shareholders were furious and they wanted answers. At the shareholders' meeting, the chairman was heckled and proposals were put to the table of making the directors accountable for the losses. The shareholders wanted answers, moreover, that the rumblings that there was something wrong was happening years ago, and that the man who had first found the issues, Mr. Clark, was thrown out by the directors themselves. To try and get the records on some form of order, the GNR petitioned Parliament for a unique solution. They themselves would purchase shares to the value that Leopold took, then extinguish them. This in turn would help balance the books, but the shareholders weren't having it. The preference shareholders wanted their 5% return, but the ordinary shareholders said that they should all suffer the consequences. But the preference shareholders won, with the ordinary shareholders holding on to nothing but worthless scraps of paper for the following 6 months. Oh, to be a fly on the wall of that following shareholder meeting. Apparently, it was a hair's breadth coming into blows. The shareholders were not the only ones to suffer at the hands of Leopold. Reynolds resigned to move to Canada, and Mowat took no time in blaming him for the mess. Mowat was sacked in just 7 months after the directors got wind that he had not checked in on the dividend warrants, which may have uncovered Leopold's deceit, and denied it was his job, but in the end he still got the boot. 3 GNR clerks were also shown the door after allowing Leopold to use their families' addresses. And the GNR was getting ready to invest $170,000 to a new venture called the Arcade Railway. This venture was run by Charles Pearson. They were forced to withdraw it in 1863 due to lack of funding, and it materialised again as the Metropolitan Railway, the railway responsible for the start of the Underground. As for Leopold, he spent several months in prison before the 11th of August 1858, designated Moving Day. He boarded the Edwin Fox, a fully rigged sailing vessel bound for Australia. She arrived in November, and Leopold worked in the prison system until he got a ticket to leave in 1862. He was still under surveillance and had several conditions, but he had some form of freedom. The news of Leopold's release filtered back to England, and where people were not best pleased and questioned the system. He was essentially pardoned in 1868, but Leopold decided not to travel back. Instead, he travelled to Sydney, where he spent his remaining days. He was laid to rest at Rockwood in the Church of England section, with no formal service and no known headstone. Jessie, while her movements were not documented, appeared to have moved on and remarried to a Mr. Munro, and is buried halfway around the world. Leopold is regarded as either a villain or a modern-day Robin Hood. Many locals would tip their hats to Leopold for these great charitable deeds, but the railways had a different view. Leopold was nothing more than a thief and a scoundrel. He would always be a topic of debate, but was he just a clever man that he knew how to hide his tracks and use charity to move up the social ladder, or did he care and wanting to share the wealth for all? I'll let you decide that for yourselves.